On a serene autumn morning in the quiet town of Oak Ridge, Brandon Cole was a man looking forward to a lifetime of devotion. His world revolved around the local Grace Fellowship Church, a sanctuary of pristine stained glass, old cedar pews, and the gentle hymns led by his fiancée, Chloe Mercer, a beloved Sunday school teacher known throughout the county for her absolute gentleness. This was a normal world built entirely on faith, community, and peace. But on November 14th, a terrifying anomaly completely shattered that illusion. A routine church collection basket was passed down the aisle, containing a single handwritten note that simply read, "He won't survive the benediction." Who was the one who wrote the note? Was it a frantic cry for help, or a calculated promise of impending violence? Yet behind the closed doors of the church office, a dark psychological chess match was actively playing out. How could a woman whose daily life was dedicated to teaching young children about grace carry out an unyielding, point-blank execution? And more disturbingly, what did the police body cam catch in those final, breathless seconds before the trigger was pulled? But investigators would soon discover something even stranger beneath the surface of this small-town romance. As we peel back the layers today on Time with X, you will learn that innocence can be the ultimate camouflage for absolute malice. There are secrets in this case that defy human logic. Open loops involving a double life, a hidden financial ledger, and an armed police escort that unknowingly walked a man straight into his final seconds. Later in this analysis, you will hear the exact, unfiltered audio recording that the state prosecution tried to suppress during the trial. A recording that completely flips everything we think we know about who was truly the predator and who was the prey. The town of Oak Ridge prided itself on its transparency and safety. Brandon Cole was a successful local contractor, an ordinary man who genuinely believed he had found refuge in Chloe's arms. But moments like these remind us how quickly ordinary life can change. When the first patrol car arrived at the church property that afternoon, it wasn't responding to a frantic homicide report. They were called for a routine domestic escort, a simple, low-stakes operation to assist Brandon in retrieving his personal belongings from the parish house. It was supposed to be a standard, completely peaceful separation between two people who had simply grown apart. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. As two armed, uniformed deputies flanked Brandon, walking him down the quiet, manicured walkway toward his parked vehicle, the air felt perfectly still. The legal system was present and watching. The shield of protection was active. Brandon believed he was entirely safe under the watchful eyes of the state. But the footage revealed something police weren't prepared for. Inside the darkened church foyer, hidden just behind the frosted glass of the main entrance, stood Chloe. She wasn't weeping. She was perfectly still. She wasn't shouting in a fit of rage. She was holding a heavy, black semi-automatic handgun, her breathing entirely flat, her eyes locked onto the back of her fiancé's head. What happened next changed the entire case. Within a fraction of a second, the heavy oak doors swung open. Before the deputies could even process the sudden movement or draw their own weapons, Chloe breached the security perimeter. The sheer velocity of the intrusion left zero room for institutional reaction. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't utter a single warning. Two sharp, deafening cracks tore through the crisp autumn air, striking Brandon at point-blank range while he was literally arm's length from the uniform officers. The man collapsed instantly onto the asphalt, his blood pooling around the polished shoes of the very deputies who were assigned to keep him alive. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger. When the officers pinned Chloe to the ground, her face pressed against the cold concrete, she didn't struggle. She didn't cry out in a sudden wave of post-trauma panic or regret. Instead, her voice was a low, chilling whisper captured clearly on the lead deputy's vest microphone. She looked directly at the dying man and uttered a single, calculated phrase that would haunt the legal system for the next 14 months. It was a statement that shattered any immediate theory of a temporary psychological break, forcing investigators to ask a terrifying question. Had this entire sequence, including the police escort itself, been orchestrated by the Sunday school teacher from the very beginning? What started as one victim quickly became something much larger. As sirens wailed in the distance, echoing off the stone walls of the sanctuary, the community of Oak Ridge was thrust into absolute cognitive paralysis. If you were in Chloe's position, looking down at a life completely shattered, what would you have done? The defense would argue she was a woman pushed to the brink of survival, a victim of an invisible domestic terror. But as forensic units downloaded the technical data from the church's private servers, the narrative of the terrified caretaker began to systematically dissolve. But the footage revealed something police weren't prepared for. Deep within the encrypted files of a cloud-backed security network, Tech analysts uncovered a series of pre-recorded video logs dating back 3 weeks before the shooting. These weren't clips of a woman hiding in fear. They showed a cold strategist practicing her draw stroke in front of a mirror, preparing for the exact moment the system would arrive at her door. The illusion of a spontaneous act of survival was dead, replaced by the chilling architecture of a staged execution. And as we prepare to step backward into the true timeline, if Brandon was the one marked for death, why did he smile at Chloe just seconds before she pulled the trigger? To understand how a house of prayer became a stage for an execution, we have to look past the blood-stained concrete of November 14th and step backward into the pristine world Chloe Mercer had built for herself. For over 7 years, Chloe was the emotional heartbeat of the Grace Fellowship community. She didn't just teach Sunday school. She organized the winter clothing drives, comforted grieving widows, and spent her evenings meticulously preparing lesson plans to teach young children about radical forgiveness. Her social identity was absolute, wrapped in a protective armor of spiritual devotion and unblemished moral purity. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger about the quiet environment she guarded so fiercely. In the spring of 2021, that quiet environment absorbed a new element. Brandon Cole entered the parish life not as a threat, but as a savior. He was a highly successful independent contractor, charismatic, soft-spoken, and eager to donate his time and heavy machinery to remodel the church's aging youth wing. It was here, amidst the scent of fresh drywall and cedar sawdust, that the devout teacher and the generous builder collided. To the congregation, their rapid romance felt entirely providential, a beautiful pairing of two pillars of working-class virtue. Within 8 months, an engagement ring was on Chloe's finger, and Brandon had moved his belongings into the historic parish house situated on the edge of the church property. This was the peak of their baseline safety. It was a world where threats did not exist. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. It began with subtle, almost imperceptible micro-cracks in Brandon's flawless presentation. Neighbors later told detectives that by the summer of 2022, the lights inside the parish house would remain glaringly bright until the pre-dawn hours of the morning. More anomalies began to surface in the church financial records. Small, irregular discrepancies started appearing in the building fund allocations that Brandon had direct control over. What started as minor bookkeeping errors quickly became something much larger. Chloe began appearing at morning services with a tense, guarded posture, her usual radiant smile replaced by an expression of deep, localized exhaustion. What happened next changed the entire case. On a Tuesday evening in late September, a senior youth pastor stepped into the sanctuary to retrieve a forgotten hymnal and overheard an intense, muffled argument echoing through the ventilation shafts from the basement office. It was the first time anyone had heard Brandon's voice lose its gentle cadence. His tone wasn't merely angry, it was laced with a cold, possessing authority that left the pastor frozen in the hallway. But the words themselves were deliberately obscured by the heavy oak doors, creating an agonizing open loop for the church staff. Moments like these remind us how quickly ordinary life can change, and how little we truly know about the dynamics playing out behind closed doors. If you were catching the very first glimpses of a dark double life in someone you loved, would you speak out, or would you try to fix it in secret? Chloe chose silence, keeping her knowledge hidden from those around her. But behind that silence, her behavioral psychology was undergoing a massive, volatile shift. She began logging into the church's closed-circuit security grid from her personal smartphone at all hours of the night, tracking the exact arrival and departure times of her fiancé's work truck. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger during the post-incident digital audit. Chloe wasn't just monitoring the perimeter out of fear for her safety. She was systematically documenting data points, creating a precise timeline of Brandon's movements. Why was a Sunday school teacher compiling a forensic dossier on her future husband? The answer dropped like a physical blow in October, when Brandon's past finally breached the sanctuary doors. A routine background check conducted for a commercial contract unmasked a sealed juvenile record from another state, a history involving high-velocity asset theft, and a clinical diagnosis of antisocial personality traits that Brandon had seamlessly buried beneath his charitable persona. The man Chloe had invited into her home and her church wasn't a humble contractor. He was a master of psychological camouflage, but the footage revealed something police weren't prepared for. When Chloe confronted him with the documentation inside the parish kitchen, Brandon didn't break down or beg for forgiveness. Instead, the domestic friction escalated into an absolute siege. According to text messages later pulled from the cloud, Brandon explicitly reminded Chloe of how much capital he had invested into her church, delivering a calm, terrifying ultimatum. If she attempted to dismantle his standing in the community, he would destroy her reputation from the inside out by exposing an entirely different set of secrets. Secrets that lay buried deep within the church's private administrative ledger. What did Brandon know about this pristine sanctuary? What hidden vulnerability had he unmasked? The viewer is left dangling over a terrifying void, because as the calendar ticked closer to November, the psychological safety baseline was completely dead. The Predator had established total leverage over the caretaker, and the first countdown to the terminal Flashpoint had officially begun. By the final week of October, the historic parish house had completely ceased to be a home. It had transformed into an active intelligence sector, where two highly manipulative individuals monitored each other's physical parameters with cold, analytical precision. The congregation, sitting blindly in the pews just 300 yards away, still viewed them as an exemplary, high-integrity couple preparing for a sacred union. But behind the closed blinds of the residence, the psychological air was thin. Chloe had stopped sleeping in the master bedroom, opting instead to sleep on the small sofa in the downstairs study with the door securely locked from the interior. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger about her nocturnal defensive measures. She had begun using an advanced consumer-grade audio extraction application on her personal iPad, leaving the device hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary on the kitchen counter to record Brandon's private late-night telephone conversations. When digital forensic units later downloaded the data from that iPad, they uncovered a series of audio files that systematically reframed the entire timeline of the execution. On these recordings, Brandon can be heard speaking to an unidentified male individual located across state lines, discussing the precise liquidation value of the church's physical assets, including the historical stained glass panels and the unrecorded cash deposits from the Autumn Capital campaign. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. Brandon wasn't just planning an exit strategy, he was actively preparing to systematically drain the Grace Fellowship treasury using the digital signatures he had extracted from Chloe's administrative computer during their initial courtship. The trap he was setting for her was total. It was designed to completely erase her professional and moral standing, framing her as the primary actor in a massive structural embezzlement scheme the moment he vanished from the jurisdiction. This next discovery is exactly why stories like this matter. It shows that in the high-stakes world of psychological manipulation, the predator doesn't merely want to break their victim, they want to completely overwrite the victim's reality so that society can never verify the truth. What happened next changed the entire case. On November 3rd, the digital surveillance log recorded a severe pattern interrupt. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the audio file captures the sharp, distinct sound of a heavy door frame splintering downstairs. Brandon had discovered the hidden iPad. The audio picks up his heavy, rhythmic footsteps crossing the linoleum kitchen floor, followed by a long, agonizing period of complete static. Then, his voice breaks through the silence, inches away from the active microphone. He doesn't scream, he doesn't curse. He doesn't scream, he doesn't curse. He whispers a highly localized, chilling pronouncement. "You think you're smart because you teach little kids about God, Chloe? I built the walls of this place. I know exactly how much pressure it takes to make them fall on top of you." This was the exact moment the emotional scale tipped into acute dread. The psychological warfare had permanently breached its boundaries, transitioning into an immediate threat of physical neutralization. But instead of contacting the local authorities or fleeing to a secure location outside the city limits, Chloe remained perfectly rooted within the domestic war zone. This behavior pattern completely puzzles behavioral psychologists who analyze capital crimes. Why would an individual with a flawless social record, clear evidence of financial fraud, and a documented physical threat refuse to engage the conventional shield of the law? The answer lies buried within the hidden files of her own internet search history. Detectives conducting the post-incident examination uncovered a series of hyper-specific search queries executed between November 4th and November 7th. She wasn't looking for domestic abuse shelters or legal advice regarding restraining orders. She was researching the precise ballistic penetration capabilities of a 9mm hollow point round through heavy autumn garments, paired with multiple map searches tracking the local sheriff's department average response intervals to the church perimeter during midday shifts. She was no longer operating as a victim seeking extraction. She was calculating variables. Every detail mattered. What started as one victim quickly became something much larger. On the morning of November 9th, a secondary vector entered the matrix. On the morning of November 9th, a secondary vector entered the matrix. An anonymous typed letter was hand-delivered to the office of the senior pastor at Grace Fellowship. The text of this letter was brief, cold, and designed to generate maximum organizational panic. It claimed that an internal audit of the youth wing construction invoices would reveal over $80,000 in fraudulent billing signatures, directly implicating Chloe Mercer in a coordinated state tax evasion scheme. The letter promised that if Chloe did not formally resign her position as the head of the Sunday school program by November 15th, the entire file would be electronically transferred to the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division. Chloe was facing the imminent public destruction of the only identity she had ever known. If you were in her position, seeing your entire life, your moral legacy, and your institutional safety about to be permanently liquidated by a professional predator, what would you have done? Would you trust a legal system that often takes months to process financial evidence? Or would your psychology begin to look for a more immediate, permanent resolution? The narration must slow down here to observe the chilling calm that settled over Chloe during those final 72 hours. According to church staff, she attended the midweek prayer service on November 11th with an air of complete serenity. She sat in the front row, nodded gently during the sermon on divine justice, and even took the time to hand-deliver a box of homemade baked goods to the parish secretary. There were no visible signs of anxiety, no frantic phone calls, and no pleas for assistance. She had achieved a state of complete emotional flatline, but the footage revealed something police weren't prepared for. When state forensic tech teams later bypassed the security encryption on her personal desktop computer, they discovered that during the exact hours she was supposed to be preparing her lesson plan for the upcoming youth service, she was actually reviewing a digitized copy of the local police manual regarding the standard operating protocols for domestic property recovery escorts. When state forensic tech teams later bypassed the security encryption on her personal desktop computer, they discovered that during the exact hours she was supposed to be preparing her lesson plan for the upcoming youth service, she was actually reviewing a digitized copy of the local police manual regarding the standard operating protocols for domestic property recovery escorts. She was meticulously studying the exact physical positioning of uniform officers during high-friction property retrievals. She knew that when an individual requests a police escort to collect their belongings from a hostile residence, the deputies are required by protocol to maintain a clear line of sight on the individual while keeping the opposing party separated inside a designated neutral zone. This piece of information is the ultimate turning point in decoding her intent. Chloe wasn't just waiting for the system to arrive. She was actively weaponizing the state's own procedural manual to arrange the geometry of the final confrontation. She needed him to request that official escort because she understood that the presence of uniform authority would create an absolute false sense of physical security for her target. She needed him to request that official escort because she understood that the presence of uniform authority would create an absolute false sense of physical security for her target. But as the winter wind began to howl across the gravel parking lot of Grace Fellowship on the eve of November 13th, a final piece of evidence was introduced into her bedroom drawer, a secondary weapon that investigators wouldn't locate until the trial was already underway, opening an entirely new mystery regarding just how many targets she had actually marked for death that afternoon. On the morning of November 13th, the illusion of safety inside Oak Ridge completely dissolved into a state of bureaucratic paralysis. On the morning of November 13th, the illusion of safety inside Oak Ridge completely dissolved into a state of bureaucratic paralysis. At exactly 9:14 a.m., Brandon Cole walked into the local precinct of the county sheriff's department. He wasn't there to confess to financial fraud or to report a domestic dispute. Sitting across from a desk sergeant, Brandon calmly explained that his engagement had ended, that his fiancée was highly volatile, and that he required an official armed civil standby escort the following afternoon to retrieve his high-value construction tools and personal files locked inside the parish house office. Sitting across from a desk sergeant, Brandon calmly explained that his engagement had ended, that his fiancée was highly volatile, and that he required an official armed civil standby escort the following afternoon to retrieve his high-value construction tools and personal files locked inside the parish house office. To the sheriff's department, this was a routine, low-risk civil assignment, a standard administrative task that required 2 junior deputies to spend 30 minutes standing on a driveway to ensure no property damage occurred. To the sheriff's department, this was a routine, low-risk civil assignment, a standard administrative task that required 2 junior deputies to spend 30 minutes standing on a driveway to ensure no property damage occurred. The state shield was completely blind, moving into an active domestic war zone with zero situational awareness. The state shield was completely blind, moving into an active domestic war zone with zero situational awareness. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. While Brandon was structuring the legal framework for the escort at the police station, Chloe was executing her own final administrative moves inside the church walls. At 11:30 a.m., she placed a direct call to the senior pastor's personal line. Her voice, preserved on the church's automated digital voicemail network, was entirely devoid of stress. She stated that Brandon had agreed to peacefully vacate the property the following day at 1 p.m. and requested that all church staff remain clear of the parish house during that hour to avoid any unnecessary public awkwardness for the ministry. This was a calculated clearing of the grid. She was systematically removing any independent civilian witnesses from the immediate physical perimeter. She wanted the courtyard entirely empty, leaving only herself, her target, and the uniformed deputies who were scheduled to arrive at the exact same hour. She wanted the courtyard entirely empty, leaving only herself, her target, and the uniformed deputies who were scheduled to arrive at the exact same hour. This is where most people make a critical mistake when analyzing this case. They assume Chloe acted out of a sudden, uncontrolled wave of emotional panic when she saw Brandon on her driveway. But the alignment of these timestamps proves an entirely different psychological reality. She was executing a highly detailed, low-frequency script where every single human actor was being guided into a precise geographic coordinate. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger about the weapon she intended to use. The 9mm semi-automatic handgun that Chloe concealed inside her velvet Sunday school tote bag wasn't registered to her name, nor was it purchased through any standard retail distributor within the state. Ballistics tracking units later traced the serial number to a cold case file from an unsolved commercial burglary that occurred 3 years prior in a neighboring county. How did a devout church instructor, whose entire life was bounded by the sanctuary and the classroom, acquire a clean, black-market firearm with an untraceable lineage? The timeline now compresses into the final 4 hours before the flashpoint. She gave each child a small piece of candy, adjusted their coats, and walked them out to their parents' vehicles with her usual warm, maternal smile. On November 14th, at exactly 9 a.m., Chloe conducted her final youth ministry class. Several parents later testified that she stood before a classroom of 12 young children, her voice soft and melodious, reading a passage from the book of Matthew regarding the absolute necessity of pulling out weeds from a wheat field before the harvest. The timeline now compresses into the final 4 hours before the flashpoint. By 12:45 p.m., the normal world was dead. The gravel parking lot of Grace Fellowship was completely vacant, the wind whistling softly through the tall pine trees that bordered the property. Inside the parish house, Chloe stood in the kitchen, her velvet tote bag resting on the counter, her eyes fixed on the long driveway. At exactly 12:58 p.m., 2 separate vehicles pulled onto the property. At exactly 12:58 p.m., 2 separate vehicles pulled onto the property. The first was Brandon's black commercial work truck. Deputy Vance, a 5-year veteran of the force, exited the cruiser and initiated contact with Brandon, confirming the parameters of the property retrieval. The shield was active. This was the protection he sought. Deputy Vance, a 5-year veteran of the force, exited the cruiser and initiated contact with Brandon, confirming the parameters of the property retrieval. The first was Brandon's black commercial work truck. The second was a white and blue Sheriff's Department cruiser containing deputies Marcus Vance and Thomas Rigsby. According to the internal radio logs, Vance checked his watch and noted that the entire operation should take less than 20 minutes. The deputies walked Brandon toward the side entrance of the parish house, their boots crunching rhythmically on the dry autumn leaves. They believed they were completely in control of a low-stakes civilian interaction, but the footage revealed something police weren't prepared for. This was the critical moment. As the 3 men approached the door, the heavy oak entrance did not swing open from the interior. Instead, Brandon utilized his own personal key to bypass the lock. The moment he stepped across the threshold into the main hallway, he found himself standing face to face with Chloe. She was positioned perfectly in the center of the narrow corridor, her arms folded across her chest, her expression entirely unreadable. Deputy Vance immediately stepped between them, placing a hand on his utility belt and stating in a calm, authoritative voice, "Ma'am, we're just here to facilitate a peaceful property retrieval. We need you to step back into the living room while Mr. Cole collects his administrative files." Chloe didn't argue. She accepted the command with total calm. Chloe didn't argue. She didn't offer a single word of protest or drop a single tear. This was the final psychological pivot. She didn't offer a single word of protest or drop a single tear. She nodded slowly, took 3 steps backward into the shadows of the adjoining room, and watched as Brandon crossed the hallway toward the office door. The geometry of the execution box was now locked. The answer would drop 3 seconds later in a spray of high-velocity glass and cordite, forcing the audience to watch as the system itself became the ultimate catalyst for an unmitigated execution. The entire physical sequence lasted exactly 4.2 seconds. The moment Brandon turned his back to unlock the cabinet, Chloe's arm dropped into the velvet tote bag resting on the adjacent side table. Her hand closed around the checkered grip of the untraceable 9mm semi-automatic. There was no hesitation, no physical tremor, and no shift in her respiratory rhythm. Before Deputy Vance could finish his next command, Chloe cleared the weapon from the bag, raised it to a horizontal plane, and fired 2 terminal rounds directly into the center mass of her fiancé's back at a distance of less than 30 inches. The sound inside the narrow, cedar-walled corridor was deafening. The first round shattered Brandon's thoracic cavity, severing his descending aorta and instantly destroying his physical capacity for locomotion. The second round exited his anterior chest wall, striking the frosted glass of the main entrance door and spraying a fine mist of silica across the uniform jacket of Deputy Vance. The contractor collapsed forward onto the hardwood floor like a felled stone, his hands still clutching the brass key to the filing cabinet. The immediate reaction of the state shield was one of total cognitive paralysis. Deputy Vance, completely blinded by the muzzle flash and the sudden concussive blast inside the enclosed space, drew his service weapon while falling backward into the doorframe, screaming commands that were completely drowned out by the ringing static in his ears. Outside on the driveway, Deputy Rigsby heard the detonations, breached the entrance door with his shoulder, and found the narrow hallway choked with white gun smoke. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger about Chloe's behavioral psychology during those chaotic seconds. She didn't drop the weapon. She didn't raise her hands in a traditional gesture of surrender. Instead, she stood perfectly motionless over the dying man, her eyes completely vacant, her arm still extended at a downward angle, pointing the barrel directly at the base of Brandon's skull. It was only when Deputy Rigsby placed his service weapon against her temple and threatened to fire that her fingers opened, letting the heavy handgun clatter onto the blood-slicked floorboards. What happened next changed the entire case. As Rigsby pinned her to the concrete floor, pulling her arms behind her back to snap the steel handcuffs into place, the lead deputy's vest microphone captured a piece of audio that would completely short-circuit the defense's future legal strategy. Chloe did not scream. She didn't say, "He was going to hurt me." She didn't say, "I had no choice." Her voice was a flat, icy whisper that cut through the sound of Brandon's terminal respirations. "I told y'all I was going to give him his pass. The church is clean now." This audio file, which the state prosecution fought to protect from public leak for over a year, completely destroys any theory of a spontaneous, trauma-induced psychological break. It reveals a mind that viewed the destruction of a human life not as a tragic necessity of survival, but as a clinical, sanitary administrative task. The Sunday school teacher had executed a clearance operation inside her own sanctuary, utilizing the physical presence of law enforcement as her literal front-row audience. By 2 p.m., the parish house was transformed into a high-density forensic extraction sector. State investigators recovered the 2 spent 9mm casings, the untraceable firearm, and the digital iPad hidden inside the kitchen dictionary. But as tech units downloaded the real-time server logs from the church steeple camera, a high-definition panoramic lens installed 6 months prior to monitor the parking lot, they uncovered a piece of visual evidence that blew the case wide open. The camera angle captured the entire arrival of Brandon's truck and the police cruiser. But it also caught a clear view through the unshaded window of the parish study. There, just 3 minutes before the shooting occurred, Chloe could be seen standing at a desk, methodically loading 8 individual cartridges into a steel magazine. Her movements were rhythmic, measured, and entirely devoid of urgency. She was counting the rounds out loud, her lips moving in clear view of the lens. She wasn't a panicked woman running out of time. She was a technician calibration testing her equipment before a performance. The documentary engine must now pivot into the high-intensity isolation of the interrogation room. 6 hours after the execution, Chloe sat inside interview room B at the county precinct. She was still wearing her green autumn sweater, now heavily contaminated with forensic residue and her fiancé's blood. Sitting across from her was lead detective Robert Torres, a 20-year veteran of major crimes. For the first 90 minutes of the recorded interview, Chloe maintained an absolute, unyielding wall of silence. She stared directly at the metallic table surface, her hands clasped in her lap, completely unresponsive to Torres's psychological testing lines. Then, the detective utilized the ultimate tactical lever. He placed a printed photograph of the handwritten note recovered from the collection basket down on the table. The note that read, "He won't survive the Benediction." Torres leaned forward and whispered, "We ran the ink analysis, Chloe. The fibers match the felt tip markers locked inside your Sunday school supply cabinet. You didn't just pull the trigger today. You announced it to your entire congregation while they were praying for peace." The response was a chilling manifestation of dark psychology. Chloe didn't flinch. She slowly raised her head, looked directly into the lens of the interrogation camera, and smiled the exact same smile that Brandon had dropped on her just seconds before his death. She leaned toward the microphone and dropped a partial reveal that would send a shockwave through the entire community of Oak Ridge. "You think Brandon was the only one who wanted to burn this place down, detective? Look at the dates on the building fund signatures. He didn't sign them alone. Someone inside your own precinct cleared those invoices." This statement opened a massive, terrifying new open loop. Was the execution of Brandon Cole merely a localized domestic killing, or was it a desperate, high-velocity silencing operation designed to permanently sever a corrupt financial network that linked the Grace Fellowship treasury to elements within the local government itself? The viewer is left completely suspended over an abyss of institutional paranoia, because as the scene cuts to black, the state prosecution is preparing to unveil a final piece of digital telemetry from Brandon's vehicle that will completely flip the moral architecture of who was truly the monster in this quiet town. The trial of Chloe Mercer commenced in January of 2025, transforming the county courthouse into an ideological battleground. To the public, she remained an enigmatic symbol, a tragic caretaker who had taken the law into her own hands when the structural guardrails of society failed to protect her from an encroaching predator. Her defense team built an absolute wall of emotional empathy, painting a harrowing portrait of a woman subjected to systematic psychological terror, financial blackmail, and the imminent destruction of her moral legacy. They argued she was a victim of acute, battered woman syndrome, an individual who existed in a constant state of mortal survival. The jury sat through 3 weeks of agonizing testimony. They listened to the splintering wood of the kitchen recording. They saw the texts detailing Brandon's chilling ultimatums. They heard the testimony of church members who witnessed the slow, agonizing erosion of her peace. When the defense rested, it felt to many in the courtroom that an acquittal on the grounds of self-defense was an absolute certainty. The social mask of the gentle Sunday school teacher had successfully insulated her from the clinical reality of the gun smoke. But the American criminal justice system is built on data, not empathy. And on the final day of rebuttal, the state prosecution dropped a massive, forensic pattern interrupt that completely shattered the defense's moral architecture. They called to the stand an automotive electronics engineer from the state's Highway Patrol Unit. The engineer held a certified data printout pulled directly from the internal electronic control module of Brandon's black work truck, a digital diagnostic log that recorded the exact physical status of the vehicle's components in the final 10 minutes before his arrival at the church property. What this data unmasked was a terrifying subversion of the truth. According to the vehicle's electronic diagnostic log, at exactly 12:42 p.m., 16 minutes before the police cruiser arrived on the scene, Brandon's truck had been parked on the shoulder of the road just 200 yards outside the church gates. The engine was running, but the driver's side door had been opened 3 separate times. The telemetry recorded a severe weight differential on the driver's seat, proving that Brandon had been pulled from the vehicle or had been engaged in a violent physical struggle within the cabin before he ever reached the driveway. Then the prosecution dropped the ultimate piece of suppressed evidence, A localized cellular intercept pulled from Brandon's personal phone during those exact 16 minutes. It was an outgoing video call placed to Chloe Mercer's private number. The state played the recovered audio file through the courtroom speakers, and the sound completely paralyzed the gallery. Brandon wasn't threatening her. His voice was broken, choked with blood and frantic panic. He was weeping. He was begging for his life, gasping through a punctured lung. "Chloe, please. Your brother. He's got the gun to my head. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll give the money back. Just let me leave." The illusion was dead. The entire narrative of the isolated Sunday school teacher facing an inescapable domestic threat was completely exposed as a masterpiece of calculated psychological warfare. Chloe hadn't acted alone out of sudden survival. Her brother, a former military contractor with an extensive history of tactical extraction operations, had intercepted Brandon down the road, physically broken his resistance, and immobilized him within the cabin. They had then forced Brandon to drive onto the church property under a literal death clock, meticulously timed to coincide with the exact arrival of the Sheriff's Department Civil Standby Escort. Chloe didn't execute her fiancé because she was running out of choices. She executed him because he was a loose thread in a multi-year, highly organized financial skim operation that she had been running through the Grace Fellowship treasury long before Brandon Cole ever stepped foot inside the youth wing. Brandon hadn't brought the rot into her sanctuary. He had simply discovered it, attempted to use it as leverage to secure his own cut, and completely underestimated the apex predator hiding beneath the velvet Sunday school tote bag. She needed him dead, and she needed it done in front of uniform officers to ensure the case would be processed as a standard domestic self-defense shooting, permanently sealing the financial records from a deeper federal audit. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The cognitive dissonance was resolved, replaced by a cold, collective outrage. While they technically acquitted Chloe on the singular charge of premeditated malice murder due to a complex jurisdictional technicality regarding the brothers' initial assault down the road, they found her guilty of voluntary manslaughter, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and tampering with electronic state evidence. 3 days later, Judge Clarence Mars delivered a sentence that many legal experts deemed unusually lenient, given the chilling depth of the calculation, but one that perfectly reflects the messy compromise of the judicial process. A split sentence of 20 years, divided between 10 years of immediate incarceration within a maximum security state facility, and 10 years of strict probation, with the final 5 years to be spent under total house arrest, under an appeal bond while her legal team challenges the technical alignment of the telemetry data. Chloe Mercer walked out of that courtroom in handcuffs, her face still maintaining that same serene, unreadable expression of spiritual calm. She had gambled her life, her legacy, and her community on a high-stakes psychological script, and while she didn't achieve the total acquittal she had designed, she had successfully kept the deepest vaults of the church's administrative ledger buried beneath a wall of legal noise. This case forces us to look directly into the mirror of our own social blind spots. We live in a society that naturally calibrates its trust based on visual cues, moral presentation, and communal standing. We look at a Sunday school teacher and we see safety. We look at a contractor with a past and we see a threat. But stories like this remind us that the human mind is capable of constructing absolute camouflage, transforming the most sacred spaces of our lives into calculated execution fields. If you were sitting in that jury box, looking at the pristine presentation of Chloe Mercer while listening to the terrifying data of that vehicle diagnostic log, how would you have voted? Did the system get this one right? Or did her social mask allow her to successfully manipulate the law for a split sentence? Feel free to share your thoughts below in the comment section. Every single week here on Time with X, we dive deep beneath the surface of the cases that define the darker side of human psychology, unmasking the hidden telemetry that conventional news cycles completely ignore. 85% of our regular viewers are currently watching without being subscribed to the engine. If this is the kind of clinical, deep-dive forensic analysis you come back for, hit that subscribe button right now. It is the single most powerful thing you can do to support the growth of this channel and keep the search for truth running. Until next time, look past the mask, watch the parameters of those around you, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous place to stand is right in front of the shield.